So we're back for another great Dark Beyond card review. Today we're taking a look at Warrior, and it seems like Warrior is going to be the home of Draenei. They're getting notably more Draenei than the other classes we've seen with Draenei so far, and very synergistic too. So we're going to go through all of these and then circle back and talk about them. So Exarch Akama here, new legendary, 5 mana, 3/6 Draenei. After this attacks, all other friendly minions can attack again except Exarch Akama. So that's a little parentheses there. So if you have 2 of these, they don't just chain infinitely, because he already says other to account for himself. The Crystalline Great Mace is not a Draenei, as you can see, but a synergy piece for it. A 2 mana 2/2 weapon. After your hero attacks, give all Draenei in your hand +2 attack. So you're already detecting the theme here, a bunch of attack synergies. Expedition Sergeant is a 3-cost 3/4 Draenei. Battlecry, the next Draenei you play immediately attacks a random enemy, which of course that could be with Akama. The Stalwart Avenger is a 4 mana 7/2 Draenei that is immune while attacking. Pretty crazy. And at the end of each turn, swap this minion's attack and health, and that each being capitalized is likely an indicator that this is on both your turn and your opponent's turn. So it's a 7/2 on your turn, it's a 2/7 on the opponent's turn, offering it some survivability at the perhaps cost of future attack. You get the Unyielding Vindicator, is a 4 mana 5/4 Draenei. Battlecry, the next Draenei you play gives your hero its attack for that turn. And do note, like, there's a lot of little attack buffs happening, which means that's a lot of potential attack on your hero. And then the final Draenei synergy piece, before we get into the other stuff later, is Captain's Log, a 4 mana spell. Draw 2 cards, costs 1 less for each Draenei you control. So there is a lot of little Draenei attack buffing and attack encouraging and attack synergies. I'll also just real quickly remind you of the neutral Draeneis that we saw so far that might be pretty relevant. For instance, the Crimson Commander. Give all Draenei in your hand +1/+1 twice off Battlecry and Death Rattle. Obviously, that's some attack buffing. You've also got the Stranded Spaceman. The next Draenei you play gains +2 health and Rush. The Rush in particular for something like Akama, where you want him attacking right away, could be valuable. The Starlight Wanderer is another little buff, +2/+1 on a Draenei. It's a higher attack value buff. There you go. And then, of course, Velen, too, could replay some battle cries here, which might actually be relevant for stuff like, give your hero attack. That's a battle cry. 2 of those off Velen. And the way this is worded, too, right? It's like it's when you play it. It's not like immediately. So it would actually work. The next Draenei you play could give your hero a ton of attack. So all in all, a lot of stuff in this Draenei package for Warrior. As opposed to like Priest or Mage, which seemingly just got a few cards, Warrior here is all in. Now, to talk about how all of these cards are actually going to work together, I guess let's start with Akama, of course, as the legendary. This is one that definitely wants you to have a board of Draenei that, have kind of stuck around for a turn, because notably this does say can attack again, not like, your Draenei can attack. It's not like if you just play them out, they have to have already been on board, resolved an attack, and then your Akama attacks, hopefully because you've given it Rush, or you have enabled it perhaps with the Expedition Sergeant so that it can attack immediately. And then, you get a second round of attacks, which clearly anytime that happens, and if you've stuck 2 or 3 of these Draenei and your Exarch comes down and he's attacking and they get to attack again, like that could obviously just be a lethal push, a finisher of sorts, where you've got some attack buffed Draenei that all have 5 attack, 7 attack, a couple of them attack in, they hit for like 14 damage, and then Akama comes down, they hit for another 14 damage. Like, clearly that's nuts. The challenge, I think, for Exarch Akama becomes the fact that you do have to kind of stick these boards for this to be worth it. Because if you don't, as soon as you fall behind on board, your Exarch Akama gets a little bit stranded, which I do think makes this feel like a real win more card, which I don't really like to use that term much, because sometimes you want to win more. Sealing games can be great as a finisher. Sometimes finishers get confused for win more cards as a derogatory term. But I do actually think this is really a win more card. In essence, you know, it's a sort of finisher, but it's one that's like very conditional and requires some help. And yes, it is a Wind Fury for your board of attacking minions. And, you know, instead of a Bloodlust, you can play a Wind Fury. But it's one that doesn't work in itself. You have to enable it because this has to be able to attack. Like, it's obviously not going to stick a turn. If it does, that's definitely a game that's already over anyway. If you're just 6 health, 5-drop, survives through a turn, clearly you're going to have a lethal setup there. So I think you have to play this and get it to attack right away. And they've given you a tool to do that, but it's still, you know, you got to line this up. You got to play the Expedition Sergeant at the right time, which is turn 4, weirdly for Akama, not turn 3. You've got some 4-cost Draenei that might be kind of absorbing your Expedition Sergeant on curve anyway. And then most of these aren't really that survivable. Like the Stalwart Avenger, you know, technically can get up to some pretty high health totals, because as you start to buff the attack on this off of your Crystalline Great Mace, like, you know, it gets to 9, it gets to 11 or whatever, that becomes a 2/11 that's hard to deal with. So this is like the one sort of sticky looking card here, but the rest of these are pretty easy in a lot of ways to clean up, and that's including the neutral ones as well. So my real big question here for Akama is, how often are you going into like a turn 5, a turn 6 or whatever with an Akama that's actually got a board that he's ready to enable? Like, I just don't think it's going to happen all that often. I think in many cases, you know, you're going to be going 1-for-1 with rush minions and removal spells, and you're going to have a couple Draenei that make it through sometimes, you know, like some little small leftover ones or something, but there's not this just like crazy sticky pervasive board presence that Draenei offers. You know, it's not like Reborn minions or Death Rattles where they're kind of getting left behind and lingering. They're being played out on curve, and I think they're going to be answered on curve, which is going to leave Akama like pretty stranded. You know, I just don't think this is going to line up all that often, or if it did, it's because your opponent already fell behind and you're probably just winning anyway, which that's the win more aspect. So as a finisher, it's a really expensive one. If you're sticking a few big Draenei, if you're sticking Stalwart Avengers and hitting face with them, this actually looks like a better finisher to me. Like, this is just a way to do damage reliably, right? This is just like, okay, here's a way to deal 7, you know, here's a way to get a nice little extra push of damage that doesn't demand all of this stuff that Exarch Akama demands. So interestingly enough, like, I think this becomes a nice finisher for a Draenei package. I could actually see a Draenei deck coming together on all of this aggression and just like attack damage output that completely doesn't care that much about Exarch Akama, and it's like, hey, I like Crystalline Great Mace, that's pretty cool. Like, I like Sergeant. You know, Sergeant is another great enabler, because if the board is clear, this can just push face with like a big Stalwart Avenger or whatever. And then suddenly this little trio from Expedition Sergeant into the Avenger into Vindicator, this is a little trio I like in combination with the hand buff stuff and the Draenei buff stuff. I could see this being a nice little mid-game aggressive core that, you know, does keep the opponent in check a little bit through stuff like Stalwart Avenger and the immediate attacks on the Sergeant, offers some lethality over the top. If you want, you know, this can be damage you just push right to face. You line up on some pretty big attack values. You could see this giving your hero easily 7, 9, 11 attack because of all these different attack buffs that are possible. So I like all of that. Now, I will note too that the Captain's Log here is another card that does demand you have a board full of Draenei, and in particular, there aren't that many cheap, easy to weave in Draenei. Like, we looked at that 1-cost card. There's a number of 2-cost cards, but it's not like you can just dump really easily like 4 Draenei to make this cost 0. So this is another one that I think kind of encourages you or demands you really have some Draenei that get left behind, much like Akama. And I think that's going to be harder to achieve. So interestingly, the kind of bookends of these cards here, Akama and the Captain's Log, they both feel a little bit more awkward and challenging to pull off to me. Whereas this middle core from Great Mace through the Unyielding Vindicator, I see more opportunity for these. Now, you know, it may be true that you still just run Captain's Log and you still run Akama because you just need enough Draenei. And, you know, they fit in. Like, you know, this is still going to absorb the buffs and stuff of your Draenei. So there's still some real upside on this as just a body in your deck with a very occasional win condition opportunity that exists for it. So, solid, but I don't think this is why I'm excited to run the deck, and I actually don't think Captain's Log is necessarily why I'm excited to run the deck either. I think I really like these 4 cards in the middle. These actually do seem really good, really high output, and offer a lot of opportunity to stack up a ton of aggression. So for me, these look pretty good. I think there is a really nice core here. Just a couple pieces leave me with some questions. So moving on over to the other side of Warrior here, it's just kind of a mishmash of stuff, it seems. This is new Legendary Spore Empress Moldara. 6 mana, 6/7, start of game, shuffle 7 replicating spores into your deck. Now, I'm going to tell you, when I first saw this, I thought these were cast when drawn. And I thought this was the most broken card ever. I thought you were just getting a bunch of free spells in your deck that summon a random 5-cost minion. Then your future replicating spores will summon it as well, which means you create a chain. So the first spore summons a 5-drop. The second spore summons that original 5-drop and a new 5-drop. The third one, then you get the first 2 and a new third one. So eventually, you get up to a board of 7 random 5-drops. But my God, does it take a lot of mana to do that? Because this is not cast when drawn. You have to play these spells. And that is garbage. This card went from being the most broken card I've ever seen when these were cast when drawn, because I thought, oh, of course, you're just going to get this on turn 1 and another one on turn 2 and just run away with the game. In reality, you're going to get a bunch of replicating spores in your hand that are totally dead cards until you spend 5 mana on them. And it's going to suck spending 5 mana, because a random 5-drop getting summoned, that is garbage. Like, it's just going to be something awful that makes no sense for you. It's just random cards, You're lucky if you just get a 5/5. And then you got to spend another 5 mana to get another one. And it's like, until you play maybe the 3rd or 4th replicating spore, they're pretty bad plays. Because honestly, even 5 mana summon 2 random 5-drops sucks for modern Hearthstone. I would argue 3 random 5-drops probably sucks, unless you got a hit on the first 2 or whatever, some crazy good card. So you're spending like 15 mana before you get anything good. You've also got a totally dead Spore Empress Moldara in your hand. Sometimes you're just gonna draw a Boulder Fist Ogre. And then the replicating spores too, you're not drawing other cards. You're drawing these spores, which are terrible cards. I think this just actively ruins any deck that it's in. I actually cannot believe how bad this is. Like, I don't understand. I guess the implication or idea for it is like, hey, it's a crazy value card. Like, you get so much value out of this. 7 extra cards in your deck, all these free bodies, which I guess 8-9 years ago might have been a thing that was relevant in Hearthstone, but these days the game is just too fast. There's too much pressure. There's too much lethality. Win conditions are so firm that you have no time for something like this to happen. Like, just spending 5, 10, 15, 20 mana to get to a point where your cards are halfway decent, and all of them just sitting in hand, stealing your draws from other good cards. I'm just astounded why the Moldara is not like a 2/3, and why the spores aren't like at least 4 mana, so that you're, getting a pretty solid start. Like, the first 2 don't totally suck in that case. So as this card stands, I feel like this is like not just not good, but running it in your deck actively makes your deck way worse, because you're gonna have games where you draw 3 replicating spores instead of a real hand, and you play one on turn 5 and you're like, oh god, I'm dead, and then you maybe play one on turn 6 and it's still bad and you're still dead. I just, like, this blows my mind. I went from the high scores thinking, god, this is cast when drawn, it's totally broken, to going to the lowest of low scores. I think this is one of the most actively harmful cards we've seen in Hearthstone in a really long time, as far as like making your deck so much worse. So next up, speaking of bad cards, this is Dwarf Planet. 10 mana spell, fill your board with random 2-cost minions that attack random enemies, which I just don't think 2-drops are big enough to make this thing compelling at all. There's so many just tiny little 2-drops, 2/2s and stuff, where, even with 7 3 attack cards, let's say, which, if you get the Bloodfin Raptor stat line, you're talking about 21 total damage output for this, which, yes, like technically on an empty board, this could be a lot of damage, right? Like, oh, hey, man, this is a super Pyroblast Regis. The opponent's board is empty. That could happen, but it's so unlikely these days to actually have any sort of empty board scenario. Pretty much everybody is playing down little minions, and what's really going to happen is, you know, you're going to summon some 2-attack stuff. They're going to run into your opponent's 3/3s. You're maybe going to hit face for like 4, 6, maybe 8 damage or something. You're kind of going to tidy up the opponent's board, but very often not. And you'll have spent 10 mana your entire turn to do that, and you're just going to get some super unreliable results and a pile of like maybe some little leftover minions that you just don't care about. So in essence, this is a really, really big commitment for a potential swing, a potential board clear, a potential face damage card that's not especially good, I don't think, at any of those elements. I think in most cases, this just really falls short. And the scenarios I can concoct in my brain where this does do a lot of face damage are just so few and far between that there's a million other scenarios where this just sits completely dead in hand and you feel like you can't risk it or can't play it, that balance is way off, and that makes this card really, really hard to run. I will say, you know, there's always big spell stuff that's possible. We did get a Draenei even in this set that discounts spells, could make this cost 5, which is sort of a little better for sure. Like, you know, 5 mana, you would definitely play this, but you have to play that Draenei first. Still, like, there's some weirdness there. I don't think that's going to be enough to enable this particular card. Maybe if some big spell dedicated warrior support comes out later, I start to look at this again and think it's a little bit more interesting, but I'm still not super convinced. Like, if you're really stretching, you could say, hey, it's for a comma, dude, I'm gonna get a board full of stuff, but it's not. It's just, there's just 2 drops, right? They're just not good enough. They die on trade-ins. It's just a bit too much of a stretch and a bit too much of an ask for me. I'm not gonna say this doesn't have outs and potential down the road, but right now I just don't think it gets there. So next up here is Jettison, a new 2-mana spell. It allows you to discover a spell and spend 2 armor to discover another. Do keep in mind that these like spend cards we've seen like this, it will just spend the armor. It's not like you have a choice in this case. If you have 2 armor, it's gonna spend it for you, which is kind of a downside in many cases. There might be instances where it's like, look, I don't want to lose my life. I just want to find 1 spell, but you have to pay the price on the Jettison. Other cases, you know, hero power last if you want to make sure you preserve that armor. But I could imagine that being like kind of a risk or a downside where you're just not happy to do that. But even when you are happy to do that, you know, discover 2 for 2, that's efficient value generation, yes. But man, it's just competing against so many other things. It's competing against other kinds of value generation and discover options that exist. You know, I'm thinking about like gift cards, for instance. I think I just want to run Gift of Garrosh or whatever, always in this kind of slot, because I know what I'm getting, reliable results. This is far less reliable, way more unpredictable, a little bit more costly. Could you run both? Of course, but there's not a lot of room in a lot of decks for these sorts of effects. And between, you know, all the various card generation that exists, all the various card draw that exists, because sometimes you just rather run card draw than discover sort of effects. I just don't think this stands up against all the competition. Not to mention, Warrior these days just gets a lot of random spells that aren't great to discover. There's like weird little buffs and little synergy piece for various packages throughout the last couple of years, right? That it's very unlikely you actually get anything in a direction that you want to get it, even over 2 choices. So maybe this gets a little bit better post-rotation with a smaller pool of spells, and maybe there's some other new package that's introduced and you just get some random thing, you know, that you don't care about. So this is kind of fine, but at the same time, just not compelling enough. So our final card for Warrior here is the Hostile Invader, a 5-mana 3/5 demon with Battle Cry, Spell Burst, and Death Rattle. Deal 2 damage to all other minions, which, you know, makes this a way to kind of tidy up the board a little bit. But it does take either work or time to get a lot of output out of this. In other words, yeah, the battle cry happens immediately, but then you got to follow it up with some spell burst if you want to push 4, which I think that's where this gets compelling on turn 5. Like 2 damage is often just not really enough on turn 5 to swing boards. By that stage, you're already looking at, you know, number of 3/3s, 4/4s, even some 5/5s and stuff, where the 2 damage just doesn't get there. If you do have the spell burst right away, it's a little more convincing, but then you have more mana commitment probably, and this isn't happening on turn 5. It's happening a little bit later. Maybe you play it on 5 and spell burst on 6, but that feels too slow again. Feels a little bit delayed. And then the death rattle too, like your opponent kind of gets to control that very often. It's going to be hard to make that worth it. Also notably, this does impact your own stuff, which in some cases might be a real downside. I doubt you're wanting to use this as a whirlwind style effect, since it's dealing 2. Feels more like a defensive tool. So in other words, when I consider all that together, I think this is going to be really clunky to run, really hard to find moments where it feels like it's making the impact that's necessary. There just aren't a lot of great board shapes necessarily for this at that stage of the game. So in other words, Warrior has access to a lot of good removal, and I don't think this stacks up compared to all the other tools Warrior has. If this was like a Draenei, maybe you could say, oh, okay, like I'm gonna think about this in a Draenei deck as like a reactive play, but since this is a demon, there's not even really an opening there for the minion type. So all in all, I think this one just looks kind of awkward. So that said, let's go ahead and rate all these cards from 1 to 5 stars. Exarch Akama is a 3-star card. Crystalline Great Mace is a 4-star card. Expedition Sergeant is a 4-star card. Stalwart Avenger is a 4-star card. Unyielding Vindicator is a 4-star card. Captain's Log is a 3-star card. Spore Empress Moldara is a -7-star card. No, it's a 1-star card, but I feel like it's bad. Dwarf Planet is a 2-star card. Jettison is a 2-star card. Hostile Invader is a 2-star card. And that is the Warrior set. Kind of an interesting one. It's a little all over the place. Really bad stuff. I think the Draenei package here is really good. I think this card in particular looks really good. This is kind of like a 4.5-star card if I did those. But I'm curious how these decks shape out. Are you guys as soft on Akama as I am? I think it's just going to be hard to find the moments where this feels impactful enough, whereas these I see a more natural line for. So anyway, fun Draenei stuff. We're going to play a Spore deck and try to make it good, because man, that is like Duskfall and Aviana levels of bad to me. It just it makes decks so much worse. I don't think ramp stuff is enough to save it. I don't know, man. Looks really bad because you're not going to hit your ramp. You're going to be drawing a bunch of spores after your games. Anyway, I've been enough on the Spore. So share your thoughts down below. Thanks for watching, and until next time, game on.